Doctors with disabilities exist in small but impactful numbers. How did they navigate their journey? What were the challenges?
What are the benefits to patients and to their peers? What can we learn from their experiences?
And how do these experiences differ within different medical systems?
I'm Lisa Meeks.
I'm Peter Poulos.
And I'm Quentin Clark from the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities. And together we are thrilled to bring you the Docs with Disabilities podcast Canadian series.
Over the next 6 weeks, we are excited to present a 6-episode collaboration with the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities.
Join us as we explore the stories of learners and providers who study or practice in Canada.
Welcome back to the Docs with Disabilities podcast. In this episode, we are joined by Doug Lebo, a current medical student at the University of Montreal and the administrative co-chair of the Canadian Queer Medical Students Association. In this interview, student Dr. Lebo and Dr. Meeks discuss intersectionality between queer and disabled identities, how to redesign healthcare systems to better support diverse patient populations, and the difference between acting as an ally and acting as an accomplice. We begin with an introduction from student Dr. Lebo.
My name is Douglas Lebo. I go by Doug. Pronouns are they, them. I'm a genderqueer medical student at the University of Montreal. I'm coming to you now from unceded Mohawk territory in Montreal. I just finished my second year in medicine, and I'm also a disabled medical student. So I was born with a microphthalmos on the left side, which was taken out when I was young. So that means my whole life I've lived with and without a prosthesis, but overall without a left eye since 3 months old.
Well, you're doing a lot of really interesting things, but something that I was drawn to is the inclusion of the queer community into all spaces. And one thing that we've been exploring more and more is the intersectionality and the impact on the learner when they're coming to the medical education space from these dual identities and the unique barriers that might be there. And so I wonder if you want to talk about your work and especially your work with the organization.
I'll start maybe just by describing some of the work that I do. So I've been drawn since the beginning of my medical education towards activism for queer and trans communities within medicine defined broadly, especially for sort of the well-being of learners, the well-being of queer practitioners, but also patients, and not forgetting that there is a large underrepresentation of trans folks and racialized queer folks in medicine as learners and certainly as practitioners. A lot of that inspiration for me, I think, comes from creating my own role models, because I haven't had anyone really to look up to and say, I see, a non-binary doctor, or I feel that I'm in a practice that recognizes trans rights and puts trans experiences forward and values the input of those patients into talking about their life stories and talking about the direction that they want their care to go. And sort of in the lead up to this interview, I was thinking about, all of that work that I've done for queer communities, and I don't know, maybe naively trying to break that apart from my experience as a disabled medical learner. And, I realized that I just can't, that intersectionality has to be central to not just my own understanding of my identities and my experiences, but also as we do try to break down these barriers and these systems that really push medicine, the medical industrial complex, medical learning, our experience in academia, our experience in society in general, and our individual one-on-one experiences with medical providers. We really need to use intersectionality to understand all of these different ways that our identities interact and that our oppressions can't really be split. If I'm talking about a time that I've experienced ableism, I can't say that transphobia and homophobia haven't had an impact on that situation. Maybe someone feels, willing to make a certain statement because they see me as a certain gender, or they see me as, in a certain way. It's important for me to not forget the activism around ableism and around the inclusion of people with disabilities in medical education while I'm doing queer activism. And I think part of that too starts by looking critically at our own communities. And I mean, there's a lot of ableism that's been experienced by folks in the queer community, by queer disabled people, by trans disabled people, and the ways that our event spaces and often like a party focused culture and a substance focused culture can be overpowering and exclusive to a lot of people. So I think we owe it to everyone. We owe it to our disabled, trans, and queer colleagues and the public and everyone to critically look at what we're doing and deconstruct that so that we can then focus our energies on these experiences that we're having in medical education and these systems that exist around us and that oppress us in the end. I think my experience as a medical learner who's queer and has a disability, I live in Montreal. I live in one of the most accepting cities in North America. It's constantly ranked as one of the safest, if not the safest place to be openly queer in I believe the world. I think Canada was recently ranked as, the most welcoming country for queer people. So I wouldn't say that I've experienced a lot of overt homophobia or transphobia in my time in medicine. Obviously, there's been a lot of not seeing my identities and the identities of my friends reflected in our learning and having to sort of do the legwork ourselves for teaching our peers about the queer and trans realities and intersex realities that come into the content that we're learning because our professors don't have the expertise or think they don't have the time or think it's not important to teach about these things. Even though I think my peers have largely been open and willing and interested and curious about all of these different realities. So, I think most of my experiences of systemic violence and individual violence in my medical education have been because I'm disabled. A lot of explaining to me what my disability is supposed to be, explaining to me what the barriers that I've faced in life are correctly or not. It's tough to identify where it comes from, I think, for me. I definitely feel when I'm in situations where I've experienced ableism as a medical learner that there's the implicit assumption that you're either a patient or a doctor. You're either needing care or providing care. There's not really any space that I've experienced where there's recognition that a doctor can be disabled, that the person providing care may have a disability, invisible or otherwise, and exist in this space that is so hostile to, I think, all conceptions of disabled people that disabled people themselves have put forward. There's this overwhelming medical model, this overwhelming desire to label and describe and put people into boxes of certain disabilities in a way, which for me feels like so much of my reaction is informed by the fact that I live out as a proud non-binary person. I would never see another queer person and say, oh, yep, that's the box you go in. Oh, yep, that's the box you go in. Everyone's experience is unique and everyone's experience is their own. And so to try to label and say, oh, no, you don't belong in this category of doctor. You're actually right now belonging in this category of disabled person or patient. And maybe it comes from doctors feeling threatened that people with disabilities can occupy the same space as they can. And maybe it comes from a place of needing to remind me that they're my superior.
I believe in part it's informed by this superiority that we've signed and accepted for decades, that the physician is the holy one,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that he has come to cure those less fortunate, and we should all be just appreciative of the time. One of the things that you've talked about and written about was the just overwhelming narrative. You call it the Western biomedicine scenario establishment. But I think that that is part of the problem, right? And that brings us back to just this medical model that you brought up before of, if you have a disabling condition, if you have a functional impairment, you need to be fixed. And if you cannot be fixed, then really the medical establishment does not want to deal with you, because I think back to that kind of godlike, right, idea that if I can't fix you, that means something's wrong with me. So if I can't fix you, then that poorly reflects on me. And I do think this is also part of why physicians don't want to treat disabled patients, is because it makes me feel bad, right? It makes
Mm-hmm.
me, the physician, feel bad that I don't have a way of doing this. And I might even throw in there that someone like you coming into an office who has disability pride, knowledge, unapologetic, which might be a bit threatening, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it's interesting because we often talk about the moral imperative for health, but I think it's interesting to turn that on its head and look at how the physician feels morally required to treat. And that's independent of whether a cure is desired, of whether, and this is not to invalidate anyone who needs medical care, who wants medical
Right. Of
care, who
course.
desires a
Of course.
cure, of course. But there are many conditions we can't cure. I mean, I have one. And you'd think, I mean, looking at it from a pragmatic medical student view, I would love to be an ophthalmologist and have me as a patient. I mean, I come in once a year, my vision's fine. You just have to kind of look at the soft tissue and say, okay, cool, bye bye, see you in a year. Like, easy. I've come in, I can identify my needs, I tell you about them, and we're done. But my experience with ophthalmologists has just been, what do I do? I can't offer you vision in that eye. I can't fix anything. There's like simultaneously something wrong with me and nothing wrong with me because there's nothing they can do. It's this odd liminal space to exist in where I can articulate my needs. I know whom I need to go to get them looked at, and I know more or less what needs to be done. But I have to navigate all of this ableism, and I have to navigate all of this moral uncertainty that isn't mine.
You're navigating this space as a patient. You have a need, you know exactly what you want, and you have to tiptoe around the people that are providing care to make sure that they feel better about the experience. We could go down a huge rabbit hole here with the power differential of even being a patient, right? And
Right.
not wanting to upset your provider, because it's very difficult to find providers.
Mm-hmm. For me, I think I see that reflected in queer activism in medicine all the time.
Yes, yes.
All the time is the idea that, we have to shop for a provider who's going to be queer friendly, who's going to understand what we're talking about, who's going to treat us like a human being with needs and desires. But then even queer positive providers. I mean, I've had gay providers who are cis and don't have any
Yeah.
identity within gender diversity who haven't necessarily finished unpacking everything that exists around gender, and that's fine. I mean, I think all of us are at a different point on our personal journeys with gender, and no one's perfect. No one's a cyborg giving purely unemotional medicine. But there's that balance between, do I have the energy to pass today? Do I feel like I'm well enough to pass today? Can I even pass because the problem that I'm going to the doctor for is inherently tied up in my queerness? And if so, do I lie? Do I wrap it up in something else and come up with a plausible, huge air quotes, straight story to be taken seriously? And then when you get there to the doctor's office, is the secretary going to misgender you because your dead name's in the system? You can have this like story built in your head and these needs and this pride and have everything ready to go and have an amazing medical provider. I mean, you can have the best doctor in the world who understands all of your problems and treats you perfectly, but because of the systems that exist around it and, on your healthcare card, I don't have the right gender marker on my healthcare card. So I go in and I get misgendered every time I go to the doctor. And most days I have the energy to deal with that and I can say, I expected this. Okay, next. But that's not the case for everyone, and that's not the case for me on certain days. I mean, when I went to emergency for a problem that had come up in the middle of the night, I was exhausted and hadn't slept. I didn't have the energy to deal with that, and I really didn't know what to do with that refusal by a system to see me for who I am. Because I think the majority of healthcare staff are in it because they care about people and they care about their patients. And, if a patient asks me to call them by a certain pronoun or asks me to understand a certain part of their life, I have no problem saying, okay, sure, that's fine. I understand. Or maybe I don't understand, but I'm going to go along with it and listen to you until I do. But the systems are so much larger, and the system doesn't feel humanist. The system doesn't feel built around and for human realities and human lives and human identities, because it's not, right? Because everything in the medical industrial complex is driven for profit in many cases, or for minimizing expenses, or, responding to centuries old problems of this government's in charge of this government's in charge of this, no one wants to pay for it, who's going to come in? Like, that's not how we build a system that centers patients in being the expert on their own life and in being able to receive the care that they want and not just the care that their physician thinks that they need at this point in time.
There's a million flags in the system to try and prevent that, but it happens. And you have disabled individuals who will request an interpreter and they show up and there's no interpreter there. You put in these fail safes, but they don't work because the EHR is so overwhelming to begin with. Your provider has literally seconds to review that before they come in to see you.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Or what if a day, you're not feeling well or you have a flare, and that's totally, that's a part of life. That's a part of living with a disease. That's a part of our lived experience. So the system needs to be flexible. And your point about asking for an interpreter, I was stunned to silence in hospital the other day because I was at work and they came on over the intercom and they asked for a, and I quote, sign language interpreter. And I live in Quebec, so we have Langage des signes québécois, we have ASL, we have people who come from lots of different countries and lots of different places around the world who may speak a different sign language. You can't just say sign language and presume the right interpreter is going to show up. That's not how it works. And, you're trying to reduce harm from a system that is on the wrong foundations. You're trying to reduce harm from a system that's not built to provide care, because in the end, the results that a system is giving are the results the system was designed to give. And so if you want different results, you've got to change the system, or at least be open to letting the people who want to change the system do so. Let us in, like, let the activists through the door and say, we're going to redo it this way. And I think we need to get away from the idea that this is only for disabled people, or this is only for queer people. Like,
Absolutely.
if you have an EHR that's easier to change names, I mean, I know people who are cis, heterosexual, who've been married for 30 years, but they have their old name in their system. And so their provider comes out and calls the wrong name. And one of my friend's moms missed a medical appointment because she was marked a no-show because she didn't respond to a name that she hasn't been called in 30 years. And so that's helpful for people other than and inclusive of people who change their names and who have a dead name that needs to be erased from every corner of the earth. And you can talk about the same things for spaces that are built with accessibility in mind. It's not just people who use wheelchairs who may benefit from having a ramp with places to rest, and folks with migraines or photosensitivity may benefit from lights that you can modulate and turn down and all of these things. Well, that's going to benefit someone who's just exhausted. That's going to benefit the resident that's just finished their 24-hour shift and wants to sleep in this room. These spaces and these systems aren't made to center human joy. They aren't made to create the outcomes that we want, and the outcomes that we know are possible with investment of time and humanism and care. And I think most outcomes that I think most doctors and most healthcare providers want to give. I mean, I'd hope that we're not all, as a profession, looking at the system and saying, meh, good enough. Like, can you imagine going to like grand rounds and being the person who puts their hand up in the back? I think the care that we're giving is good enough, actually.
In the next section, student Dr. Lebo and Dr. Meeks continue their conversation to consider what a healthcare system that centers joy and patient care might look like. Listen or read along as they share some of the changes that they imagine would foster more respectful and supportive medical care for all patients.
You bring up the resident who's finishing a 24-hour shift. I mean, that in and of itself is a joy depleter. Maybe the system isn't changed because we have people who are exhausted and overtaxed and trying desperately to read an EHR and figure out where everything went. I know a lot of physicians. I don't know anyone who would say, absolutely enter medicine. This is the best place to be. You will be fulfilled and treated with respect and humanity. I don't know that person.
It's transformative to look at the system and say, no, this isn't good enough. No, I do want to center joy for providers, for patients, for the people that come with them, for everyone in the system. And joy is itself so healing, because I think joy, when we are proud of ourselves and when we've, put the personal work in to unconstruct all of these ideas that society tells us, whether we're queer or disabled or racialized, all of these things. When systems center joy, when groups of friends center joy, when non-traditional healthcare practitioners center joy, good things happen. I mean, pride happens, and accessibility marathons happen, and going and cataloging needs on a campus and friends building ramps out of leftover wood on the weekend happens, and connections and human joy happens. But I think we need to, really critically look at the system and say, what in medicine is giving joy? What in medicine is centering patients? If I stop limiting myself to how can I make this incremental change to the system? How can I make this a little bit better? And if I say, no, what we have isn't working for a lot of different groups, isn't working for, I think, anyone with intersectional identities, we need to start again, use our imagination, use our creativity, and say, let's try it out. And we need to have models for systems change that allow for failure too, and allow for saying, well, that didn't quite work. How can we learn from that and try again? But we can't stop. We can't stop at incremental change. We can't stop at saying, well, that didn't work. Okay, bye. We have to be confident, I think, that centering the experiences of the most marginalized people, of the people who've lost the most to the medical industrial complex, as we've created it over the last, century, if not more, if we center those people's experiences, they'll teach us about the ways forward, I think, and they'll teach us about the ways that we need to be rebuilding systems, making them function.
This is an important conversation, and the listener might be thinking, what does this have to do with disability? And I'm thinking it has everything to do with disability. It has everything to do with access to healthcare. Healthcare that is supportive, that is informed, that is respectful. Many people are trying to do that through competencies, specific competencies. Let me teach you how to take care and care for queer folk, right? Let me teach you how to care for somebody that has X disability. My concern about that is there is not one way to provide equitable care. Let's just take an actual diagnosis like rheumatoid arthritis. What patient A comes in with, all of the kind of conflating things that are happening in their lives or that are related to their jobs, their families, their financial situation, are all things that interact with their chronic health to either improve it or reduce it. And a solution, and this is an actual example from a patient telling someone to join, someone that's in a colder climate like the two of us are, join a gym that has an indoor heated pool and swim. That will help you. If that person doesn't have transportation because of their disability, if that person doesn't have financial resources to join that gym, if that person has another chronic illness and cannot be in spaces where there are tons of people, like a shared space, right? I'm just thinking of all of the layers that would make a generalized piece of advice fairly useless and might actually make the patient feel worse. It's highlighting the lack of access they have across different domains of their life.
Yeah, that makes me think about the different ways that people can be excluded from care, because it's not enough to throw a ramp on the front of a building and put some power doors on and say, okay. Your point about transportation is important. And I mean, it's not just what happens in the medical space or on the sidewalk in front of the clinic. It's also all of the ways that disability, queerness, or any identity impacts directly someone's health. I can't dissociate for a patient who's excluded from going to work because of a mobility device that they need, or for really whatever reason associated with their disability, and the fact that they're malnourished or not able to access the medications they need. I can't dissociate that from the ableism in their life. It's not that they're uncompliant or a bad patient. It's that the system has failed them, and not just medicine in this case, society in general. And, I think we focus rightfully in certain ways on ways that medicine excludes people and ways that we need to be better providers and ways that in the doctor-patient interaction, we can be better to our patients. But that's not it. That's not the only determinant of health to use the terms that we do in public health. That's not the only thing that's a deciding factor for this person's health. And to go about making moral judgments and saying, oh, well, this patient's non-compliant, they didn't take their medication, and that's why they're in a disease flare. And if only they took their medication. Well, the buck doesn't stop there, because they can't take their medication because they can't afford it. Why can't they afford it? Because they're excluded from working, or they can't get to work, or anything. Situations are endless. So no, it doesn't stop by assigning a moral value to the patient because of the oppression that they experience. And, and you can talk about the ways that sometimes physicians react to people who share stories about the ableism that they experience or the homophobia that they experience, and the sort of discomfort that the physician has, this like, I can't fix that for you. There are lots of things in medicine that we can't fix. So to experience those moments when physicians feel uncomfortable with the systemic violence that oppressed people live is really disappointing to me. It's really, it makes me question the value of some of the things that we're taught, and a lot of the things that we're not taught, that we don't have access to ways of understanding systemic violence that end up impacting the health of most of our patients. All of the different types of exclusion. I mean, there are so many important considerations that I think don't get named, but I think it can be powerful to name them. To say to a patient, I understand that it's been really difficult, this ableism that you've been experiencing and the lack of access. We recently had some really bad thunderstorms in Ontario, and I know someone who uses a wheelchair who hasn't been able to leave her apartment because the elevator doesn't work. There's no generator to the elevator. And so to be able to say to a patient, it makes sense that your disease has gotten worse because you've been cooped up, and I understand that that's really isolating. I'm sorry that you're living that, can be a really powerful way to connect with someone and to strengthen that relationship. I think that just says, I am your ally, I understand. But we need to not stop there, because I don't need more allies. I love allies. I do. I love everyone who is. But what I need are accomplices. I need people who are willing to come with me and break down these systems that oppress me and people who look like me.
In the next section, student Dr. Lebo and Dr. Meeks dig into the difference between an ally and an accomplice. Listen or read along as they share concrete examples of what it looks like to act as an accomplice.
Talk to me more about that. Define that. What is the difference? What does an accomplice do that an ally doesn't do?
The difference for me between an ally and an accomplice is really informed by a document design, I think, from Indigenous Action Media. So this was something that came across, called Accomplices, Not Allies. You can Google it, it's available online. It really challenged me because I was working before I entered medical school for 2 years. So I finished my bachelor's. I was working on a master's in public health, but I was doing it part-time. So I was working in First Nations education. So I was doing science and robotics education with 6th to 8th graders. It was fabulous. So I was working in the Kanien'kehá:ka community called Kahnawake, just south of Montreal. And it was such an eye-opening, life-changing experience for me to be invited into the community and to, do work that they were asking for someone to come in from the outside and do. And either one of my friends or one of my coworkers sent me this short PDF, it's only a couple pages, really calling into question the role of the ally and defining, which was for me the first time I'd read about it, the ally industrial complex, which is this idea that when allies just position themselves as an ally, as a way to gain credit or as a way to seem woke or seem accepting or seem like they're on the right side of history, that's not exactly what we need. That's not actually responding to a need of the oppressed person. That's responding to a need of the ally in their role in the overculture. So that idea of an accomplice for me comes when the ally starts to break down how they've internalized those structures of oppression, how they may still be participating in them and benefiting from them systemically or personally. And so that for me, I think that was an important step for me in looking at the ways that I benefit as a settler, as a descendant of settlers on non-ceded Kanien'kehá:ka land, and, calling into question the sort of credit that I received when I said, oh, I work in Ganawage, I teach elementary kids science and robotics, it's really fun. All of that is true, and the community asked me to come in and do it, and I'm very grateful for that. But I then had to push myself and say, no, I need to go further and be an accomplice. And so I would then start shifting my narrative with other settlers and saying, oh, do you know where that is? Do you know a little bit about the history of the people? Do you know where their traditional hunting grounds are? Let me tell you something cool and interesting about their culture that I learned from one of my students recently. Let me encourage you to come to a powwow. Let me encourage you to go and read a novel or a story or something about this people that I'm working with and that I'm loving, because an accomplice, doesn't stand by and say, oh, that's awful what you're experiencing. An accomplice says, whoa, 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 that's not okay. You can't do that to my friends, and goes in and helps, not taking the lead, not saying, this is what we need to do. This is what you need to get out of, this situation of oppression. But what can I do? Here are my hands. Here is my privilege. Here is my role. Where do you need me? Where can I go and do this work? And also, recognizing that it's not everyone who's ready or in the right space or in the right time to do the education or to tell you where you need to go and what work you need to do right now. So, part of the accomplice's role is to also know when to step back and say, okay, no, there seem like there are enough people here. You're taking the lead. Call me if you need me. I'm over on the outside drawing attention to this, saying, go and check this out. This is a really cool activism event that's happening. Come to this, contribute to this change that needs to happen that's being led by this community. And so that for me is the difference between, the ally who in the end is in it for themselves and the accomplice who is in it for everyone.
That's really powerful. And I see the difference. I understand the difference when you explain it. And I want to kind of push you a little on this to help the audience, to help the listener understand it from a disability perspective, right? So I'll give an example of what I think it is, and then you give an example of something that you've seen. And I think maybe between the two of us, this will be really helpful to the listener. And if I'm wrong, I want you to tell me. And so there are a lot of people who will join the disability activism group, will do general things that are involved in the group, general social things, talk about this space with others. I think the intentions are good, but when ableism is present in the learning environment, the person with the disability is kind of left to fight their battles, right? Disabled people that are going through a medical education training are slaying dragons all the time, just every day. And they're choosing, right? What dragon do I slay? Is it worth it? My time and effort. And to your point about the toll it takes on your health, that takes a huge toll on your health. So an accomplice is somebody who recognizes an inaccessible situation or an ableist situation. And as the non-disabled person, may approach that faculty member or that person to educate them, to say, I noticed this, I saw this, I overheard this. And, as somebody who is in this space as a visitor or as an ally, or if they want to use the word accomplice, there were undertones of ableism in what you were saying. And do you know what ableism is? Is there a way that I can help you understand or contextualize what might have occurred in this space? And I would love to talk to you about how to improve it. I would also love to connect you with that learner or help you go back and correct whatever damage has been done.
Yeah, and I think that's a good example. I'm trying to think of a time that I've seen someone act as a good accomplice. Oh, actually, not very long ago, I was at a small gathering with a friend and some folks that I didn't know who were her friends. I was out to my friend, and I believe she's, spoken to her friends and referred to me with they, them pronouns and all of that. And I had talked, a little bit at the beginning of this gathering about my queerness, and I was wearing a dress. And at some point, one of the people that I didn't know, he was talking about someone that he had gone out with in university who had since changed the pronouns that they use and now uses they, she pronouns. And the language that he used around that was really, wasn't the best. I believe he said something along the lines of, oh, she's a they now, which it's a little gross. And so I was like not actively participating in that conversation. I just kind of overheard it, but we were only 5 people. So like it was fairly obvious. And so what my friend did, she's cis, she doesn't, belong to the gender diverse community, but I think in the moment acted not just as an ally, which could have been like, I think an ally uses the right pronouns and responds to, maybe shares like trans positive and non-binary content on Facebook and maybe goes and consumes some of that content from time to time. But she acted to me as an accomplice because she said, oh, hold on. I don't really like how you said that. That's not a way that I would want to be referred to. Do you want to try again and maybe see if there's another way that you could phrase that? And do you see how that would make someone feel dehumanized to be referred to as a they? And her friend, responded really positively and probably at around this point clued into the fact that there was a non-binary person standing right beside him who clearly was listening and corrected himself and said, oh, okay, I understand. I think that came from a place of ignorance on my part. I don't really know anyone who uses pronouns other than he and she. And I guess, it's weird for me to conceptualize using pronouns for a person that I knew when they use different pronouns, which is like a fair sentiment to have. Like it's a fair sentiment to say, wait, I'm confused. I knew them as this pronoun. They want me to use this pronoun now. Like, okay, let me assimilate that. Let me practice that. Let me make sure that it comes out. Let me apologize quickly and not center myself if it happens. Sure, fine. All, reasonable feelings to have, reasonable work to do. But I really appreciated that my friend in that moment acted as an accomplice because I didn't know this person. I had just met him. Found him kind of cool otherwise, so didn't really want to, like, the very first time I'm meeting him, be like, hey, you can't call people that. That's really not nice. Like, here's why. Let me launch into, I'm very guilty of launching into like a 20-minute monologue on queer theory. And I want to say she did me a favor, but it's not a favor. She did the right thing in responding to that in the moment and saying, no. And, I don't know if she maybe looked at me and saw that I didn't really want to like engage. I wasn't putting my armor on and wasn't getting my sword out of its sheath. So she was like, oh, okay, you know what? I got this. You sit back, enjoy. This is my friend. I'll correct him and we'll just check in a little bit later just to make sure that you're doing okay. And that for me, that was perfect. I had a great time that night. I had no hard feelings towards anyone present. And it was just no worse than walking down a hallway and finding a sticky spot and realizing somebody spilled coffee and you go, oh, okay, And then you go on with your day. That was it. And so I think the role for the accomplice for me, as I experienced it there, was that role of, we talked about, do I slay this dragon today? Do I let this pass? Do I not have the energy to deal with this today? And the role of the accomplice is to say, let me check in with you. No, you're good? Okay. Let me take the sword and go slay this dragon
Yeah,
for you, because I
exactly.
got this. I understand. I've seen what another dragon has done to you. I've seen what the damage that this can do. And I am ready and willing to join the fight with you, quite literally, like to jump into the fray when it gets awkward and when it gets uncomfortable and say, I got this. And then, of course, to check in afterwards and make sure that it was the right thing to do and that they'd said the right thing. And all of that is, important. But it's really, in those crunchy, action filled moments where I think the accomplice can jump in and say, no, I'm gonna take on this battle right now, because I've heard what other people have told me that fighting this battle constantly does to them and does to their health and does to their morale. And I recognize that they need another pair of hands in this battle. And I can step into that space because I've educated myself and I've undone a lot of the internalized homophobia, ableism, racism, all of that. And I have connections to this community that I can come back and check in and make sure about safety and make sure about that I'm, up to date, because things change and the way we phrase things changes and language changes. And that's important to recognize and follow. So it's that ongoing connection, I think, that can fuel a successful accomplice in doing the work that they're doing to change the big wide world.
In the next section, the discussion shifts to highlight actionable items for listeners seeking to better support queer, disabled, and other marginalized communities within healthcare spaces. Listen or read along as student Dr. Lebo shares their thoughts on what administrators and leaders can be doing now to create more inclusive and respectful spaces.
When administrators or faculty members are listening to this podcast, they're usually listening for something actionable, like a nugget. And I think this ally to accomplice description is really helpful to people, right? Part of it is taking up the load and doing part of the hard work to lessen the load on those that carry a big tax that comes with their identities. But how can administrators or faculty member also engage if they can't count on the system to do it? How can they individually act?
Absolutely. So I think, we talk about harm reduction and we talk about the work that needs to be done to dismantle the system, to break it apart, to put it back together. And we'll get there someday at some point. And I think the low-hanging fruit, the action that needs to happen in certain systems probably varies so much from system to system that I would say the first thing to do is to bring us to the table, is to say, out the window with this model of I decide what's best and I went through it, so you need to go through it, and I'm going to decide the requirements. No. Open up the door and invite marginalized people, invite disabled people, invite queer folks to the table. Because we're still going to be doing the work that we're doing in our communities. We're still going to continue, fighting for accessibility for our friends. We're going to continue to make the change that we want to see in the world, because fundamentally our communities exist and are built around this kind of work, and that's going to keep happening. For someone who's not a part of the community to participate in that can be welcome at times, but in order to know what work needs to be done, you have to listen to us. And that's not in a venting session way. That's not in a tell us what's wrong and we'll listen to you and validate your emotions. Sometimes that's necessary, but what I mean is bring us to the table when curriculums are being designed. Bring us to the revision meetings of what happened in this course this year, what was good, what was bad, what can we change for next year, and ask, can you go out to your communities that are present in the student body? Can you go out to people that you know in the rest of society and ask, what was wrong for you? What can we do better for you and people who are like you in the years to come? And I think that opens the door to building the relationships that need to be built to really make safe learning environments. Because if we're constantly acting from oh, this went wrong this year, this person complained, okay, we're going to make a change, we're going to do a little better. We fall a little bit back into what happened before. Okay, another complaint, we're going to make it a little bit better. It's this never-ending cycle of incrementalism that just doesn't respond to the needs that are constantly being identified and that I'm constantly hearing on the community action side of things. So it's like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, right? Like you need to talk, you need to be open to listening to what we need. I can give an example at one of the universities here in Canada, even until a few years ago, I think even until this year, the medical students, huge air quotes, lived a day in a wheelchair. Yeah. And there was just no openness to listening to students who used wheelchairs and faced huge accessibility problems on campus when they said, whoa, that's awful. Don't do that. Listen to what we're telling you, what my day-to-day experiences are. That's enough. That's awful enough.
Or do not appreciate or hold in high esteem the type of disability activism, the talk, the simulations where the non-disabled person leaves the simulation, leaves the talk, they feel better about themselves. I did something that taught me about disability for 40 minutes and they've left, they don't think about it ever again. If I do a training or if I'm in a space, I want people to leave and feel uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I want them to feel that little bit of ick, right? Like, ooh, all of a sudden I have a little bit more awareness that that's probably not a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Or I have a little bit of awareness that, wow, the way that I teach or what I teach or language I've been using could be really offensive to people. Or the reverse, that disability and disabled are not bad words. People will give these talks and everybody's so excited, but it doesn't spark any action.
And that's not enough. And in fact, one of the points that I've heard that you've just made is that that can be dangerous.
It's
I mean,
harmful.
that can
It's harmful.
open the door to, oh, well, I learned about this. And so I know everything that there is to know about that experience that I had for 40 minutes. Well, that leads to exactly what I've experienced, which is let me explain to you what your disability is. And that's why I say you have to listen. And that's why it has to be, like you say, actionable. You have to live in the discomfort. And I think that for me was part of, to come back to the ally versus accomplice moment there, that for me was part of the transformation from ally to accomplice, because ally feels good. Ally feels, I think I'm helping, I'm challenging these things that I learned that were wrong.
I'm wearing a
Cool.
t-shirt.
Exactly. I'm showing the symbol for the cause. This is great. But accomplice has had moments where it doesn't feel good and is ready to act when it doesn't feel good, is ready to say, oh, that feeling in my gut that wasn't an okay thing and that's going on in the space. I need to correct that.
Yes, and I'm willing to use my privilege in this space to do that.
Exactly. Exactly. And it comes from, having lived that discomfort and having lived that empathy for the lived experiences of oppressed people to be able to then act as an accomplice on these actions that have been identified in partnership, And I think oftentimes, whether it's for queer activism or disabled activism, I think sometimes the community organizers and the activists get villainized by people in institutional systems because, one, we're openly hostile to those systems, but two, they think we're going to walk in the room and ask them to burn down the building and build it again. 99.9% of the time, that's not the ask. And we're not inhuman. We arrive with an ask. The institution can arrive with, okay, I need to send an email to this person and work under this system and submit a request to this committee. This is how we're going to do it. I think the feasibility needs to be brought to the table on the institutional level, because otherwise the activists and the communities get bogged down in the work of figuring out, what door do we enter through and where do we start to get this moving? I think it takes a little bit of buy-in from the institutions that we're trying to make better in order to build a better system, in order to make the change happen that needs to happen.
As usual, we end this episode with student Dr. Lebo's advice for healthcare leaders and learners in our audience.
The last question we always ask, which I'm sure if you listen to the podcast, right, is what is that advice that you would give to a learner in the pathway? And we've expanded this in recent months to say, hey, if you want to give advice to faculty or administrators, that's fine too. So I invite you to give advice to any of the stakeholders in medical education.
I'll start with the people running the show. So I think my advice for people who find themselves in any position of power is to, yes, reflect on, what that means in the individual relationship and reflect on what that power can have as influence over the people that directly report to you and how other people in the system report to you. Great, sure. But also, what are the systems in place that have put me in this position of power? How did I get here? And what's been left behind? What have I left behind? Because have I left behind my empathy? Have I left behind a part of my humanness? Have I compromised in a way that I shouldn't have? Or, needed to in a certain moment to access that role? And whom has been left behind? What person has been left out of this? Who didn't even apply for this position? Who didn't even feel like they're welcome in this space? Who's not in the room? Because we can start with who's there, and we need to. Can't ignore who's in the space making decisions, who's got the power. But I think we have to be honest and realistic in also asking who's not here and who's been excluded in this whole process of, me coming into this position and the decisions that I make, in order to make sure that that power is being used in an informed way, in a way that is trying to understand the realities around whatever position of power that might be. If I'm rewriting a medical curriculum, who are the experts that I'm inviting? Who are the experts I'm not inviting? Who are the people that exist outside of medicine completely because they never got a chance to go to medical school and come in and be considered an expert? How can I define expert more broadly and better understand all of these important things that I'm trying to make decisions on? And so I think that then flows into my advice for learners, which is be unapologetic. Find people that are going to help you be safe. And once your safety is confirmed, once your safety is in most situations non-negotiable, be loud, be proud, be yourself, be your weirdest, happiest, most prideful and joyful disabled or queer or trans or whatever self. Because I think that our peers, at least in this sort of new generation of people coming in and up through medicine, there's an openness there and there's a willingness to learn. And, I think the fact that when you've gotten into medical school, you've jumped over certain barriers or rolled through them and broken them down. And I think that, we're accessing positions of privilege in society. And even if that's happening despite other ways that we're not privileged and other minority identities, I think that we need to be accomplices to our own liberation. I think we need to work towards showing other people in medicine what our lives are like and what we think, and be loud and show up and call out and say, no, that didn't feel right, actually. No, that wasn't acceptable, that this reality was left out of that course. And no, I don't think it's fair that all of my professors have been white, or, whatever the reality is, speak up about it so that other people can see you, because I think it's a tool of capitalism and a tool of ableism and all of these systems that try to break us apart and try to put us in silos. And so the queers are over here and the disabled folks are over here, and people working for racial justice are in this other box. But none of us are free unless all of us are free. So
Absolutely.
Don't just accept what's happening in these systems. Find the people that are willing to fight with you, because they're there somewhere, I promise, at least one. So go find them. And I think the easiest way to find them, at least in my experience, has been to live my open, proud, happy, genderqueer life and see who comes to me. Because those are the people that are going to fight with you, and those are the people that are going to care about you and, pick you up when something awful's happened and you need that. And those are also the people that are going to pick up the megaphone and shout in it when you've screamed for so long you've lost your voice.
I cannot thank you enough. And I just have this sense of warmth and calmness, and it is lovely. It was lovely talking with you. This was really a joy for me. This was a bucket filler.
Yes, I'm
And,
so happy to hear that. It was a joy to talk to you as well.
Yeah.
It really was.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time and your advocacy and sharing your story and really highlighting, bringing more awareness to, those that are at the intersection of disability and queer identity, because it's important.
Thank you for inviting me and having me here.
To our guest, Doug Lebo, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We are so grateful for your honesty, your openness, and your eloquence in sharing your experiences and wisdom with our audience. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We hope you enjoyed this interview, and we encourage you to check out the other episodes in our collaboration with the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities, and to subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. We also encourage you to check out the International Conference on Academic Medicine, which will be hosted by the Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada in Quebec City in April of 2023. The keynote for the conference will focus on ableism in medicine. Head to icam-cimu.com to learn more. This podcast is a production of the Docs with Disabilities Initiative as part of a special collaboration with the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities. This podcast is supported in part by the University of Michigan Medical School Department of Family Medicine M-Disability Program, the Stanford Medicine Alliance for Disability Inclusion and Equity, and the Ford Foundation. This series was made possible through funding from the Canadian Federation of Medical Students Strategic Innovation Fund. The opinions on this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of their respective institutions, partner organizations, or funders. It is released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Non-Derivative License. The series was developed by Quentin Clark and Lisa Meeks and produced by Lisa Meeks, Sophia Schlossman, and Jacob Feeman.